Hi, I'm Dex, and we're going to talk about stubbornly held protective attitudes. In psychology terms, defense mechanism, not a bad way of saying it. In Scientology orientation, service facsimile, which, what does that mean to anybody who's not trained in Scientology? Not much. And I like to stay away from uh, Scientologies or any specialized language that doesn't communicate well to someone who's not versed in it. Besides which, service facsimile, meaning a mental image that a person uses to serve themselves in some way, is a little vague. And Scientologists come to think of that idea as barely meaning some way of expressing, I'm right and you're wrong, making other people wrong. And that's what the Scientology think pretty much has been reduced to on this idea of service facsimile, which was not the original concept, what it was discovered to be in the early 1960s, but it's what it's become. And that idea of you're wrong and I'm right as being a service facsimile is very superficial. It's not even always present with a service facsimile. It's not necessarily part of it. So, what have we got here? What we've got is when you experience something that's too painful, too unpleasant, too repulsive in some way, you can't get into it, you can't permeate it, you can't have it, you've got to get away from it, you've got to push it away from you. Really painful experience. Well, there's a really excellent probability that you're going to come up with, using your own mental force, some forceful idea to dismiss whatever this circumstance is, so you don't have to experience it now or ever. And that's what a stubbornly held protective attitude is. It's expressed by some particular phrase you've used and you've put energy behind that. It can be don't talk to strangers. It can be all women are crazy, all men are lazy, anything. But behind that idea is a fear of something that just cannot be experienced, that must be pushed away. There's literally millions of these. There's no limit to what they can be or how they can be expressed. From a counseling session or processing standpoint, or in Scientology terms, auditing, the real importance of this is that when you've got a client, let's say it's you want to handle or resolve some difficult condition you want to be rid of. Well, chances are good that as we try and address that area, we may hit a wall of resistance that says we really can't enter into this. And it's going to block your ability to get in there and fully process this material. And so we need to address that stubbornly held protective attitude that is blocking your access to truly process this area. One example of how this comes up, and this is from an actual session experience a few years ago. I had a client and we were processing the idea of a certain ability that he had regained through what we were doing. And we were running a procedure to make that stable and permanent, that ability gained, which included steps of considering and processing the idea of using that very ability to help other people, to have others use that particular ability to help him, and so forth. And on the section, the part of this where we addressed his having other people help him with this particular ability, he really consistently only gave answers to me that were not allowing for him to be helped by another person with this ability. His answers were of the nature of, well, as long as other people have that ability and use that ability for themselves, I consider that helpful. I couldn't help but notice that he was not accepting the possibility of receiving help from others. That was in all of his answers. Now that's where a heads-up counselor pays attention to that and doesn't leave it at that and helps the client to fully process that area. Because if he's dismissive of receiving help from other people with a given ability, he's going to have issues with that ability for himself, inevitably. Never mind the fact that it's going to create problems with others, this refusal of help. It's not the best way to be, and we don't just let that be. There's something going on there when you see that, and it's a stubbornly held protective attitude. So what do we do when we see one of these? Well, my approach in this case particularly, but the basic question I use is there some idea, thought, or attitude you have that says this condition must stay as it is? It must not be let go of, or it must not be changed. And in this case, of course, it's tailored to, is there some idea, thought, or attitude you have that says that you shouldn't accept help from other people in this way? And, it doesn't take long. It only took a few seconds for him to come up with a particular phrase, a stubbornly held protective attitude. In this case, it had to do with his experience in what's called the Church of Scientology's C organization. Any Scientologist hearing this knows what I'm talking about, but it's a what they call a billion-year contract. It's a lifetime and beyond commitment to work within this particular Scientology organization, full-time, live and work there, and be subject to whatever you're told to do, and complete whatever action, no matter how daunting it is. It's very challenging. It's not fun a lot of the time, and it becomes very abusive for most people. And it demands of you that you be quite super, and most people will eventually break from that circumstance. Anyway, the point is that his decades of experience in that role of the Scientology C organization, very much the condition was enforced on him of you've got to get done whatever you're told to get done, no matter how daunting, how formidable, how unreasonable, or even illogical it is to expect you to accomplish whatever this is. And so it's very much impressed on the C organization, the Sea Org members, that they're to make it go right, no matter what the challenge is. And that can mean days without sleep. It can mean all kinds of unpleasant, difficult to experience things. And so this has kind of been engraved into him to, accepting help is for weaklings. That's the attitude. And his stubbornly held protective attitude was that. It was, help is for weaklings. That may have been the exact wording. It was very close to that if it wasn't. So now we've got him actually examining this idea of accepting help is for weaklings. It sounds very brave and strong on the surface, but it's not hard to see how that's going to be a problem for a person. Here's a client coming to me seeking help, who is stuck with the stubbornly held protective attitude of help is for weaklings. It's not hard to understand how that's going to impede his counseling. So anyway, that was the phrase, that was it. So all we need to do here is to get the client to fully examine, analyze, and thus decide to dismantle this particular attitude, get it out of the way, just through examining it rationally. So there have been other prior methods to do this. There have been improvements along the way, particularly outside of Scientology. And I've been following this path, and what I discovered was there was something very basic missing from the understanding of what this is. It's a protective mechanism. So there are certain questions that have been used to dismantle this attitude. And I found them somewhat effective, but they weren't getting to the core of what this is. There are questions like, how is help is for weaklings, how does that make you right? How does that make others wrong? It's not hard to see how a person could use those that way. But there's much more to it than that. And there's more effective questions to use along with that. The very basic question to ask, if you think about it, I think you'll agree this is pretty obvious. What is help is for weaklings intended to protect you from? But generally, you want to kind of take this apart level by level before you get to that core question. Not always, and I'll explain more about that as we continue. So we will start with getting the client to give you the phrase that best conveys the idea for them. And that will take a minute, 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes on average. They may rephrase it a few times and they feel they've got it just right, they've nailed it. And what I'm asking them to give me is whatever word or phrase says it best for you. That's what you want. What says it best for you? And having gotten that, the first question to ask to help the client really permeate this, really enter this area and feel and process the energy of it successfully. This energy largely and particularly and mostly is in the spectrum of emotions. So the first question I'm going to ask once the attitude has been articulated in a particular phrase is, what emotion is in that? In this case, what's the emotion of help is for weaklings? What's the emotion of that? And as soon as you ask that question, the person is in. They're processing this now. In looking at it, they're starting to let the emotion siphon out of it through experiencing it, just examining it through that question. That's what we start with. Having done that sort of preliminary step, we'll go from there to how does help is for weaklings make you right? When we ask these questions, any of these questions, understand that there is no limit of answers to allow the client to give you in response. We want to allow the client to fully express any and every thought, idea, or feeling that comes to mind in answer to every question. That's what processing really is. We don't get worried about getting the next question in. That's not what you should be thinking about while your client is busy answering. You want to sort of take a laid back attitude, invite them to continue, and for the most part, don't say anything. Don't draw attention to yourself. Don't rush them. Your client should understand that they should allow whatever comes into their mind to fully surface, even if it doesn't seem to immediately answer the question. The relevance will emerge as long as they just follow their own spiritual compass, their own stream of consciousness. This has borne out in thousands of sessions that I've done. I know that Scientologists are trained in the idea of very quickly getting an answer out of the person, and it should be obvious that it answers the question. That's very superficial processing. That's not the point. The client is not benefited by you're receiving their answer as quickly as possible. They're benefited by the examination and spiritual or mental digesting of the material that takes place when you direct them to do so with a question. So the more time the client spends considering, looking, and answering before they look up to you to indicate they're really ready for the next question, the more processing is really taking place, the more gain they're having. So please don't be in any rush to have them finish to get your next question in, and your client should understand this. They're invited to give every answer that comes into their minds, to take their time to really experience this, and that's where the processing is. You want your client to understand that. So we've done this first question now. How does help is for weaklings make you right? That was as I said, that was the answer the client gave in one particular circumstance. The answers might be, it makes me better than the other person because I'm self-reliant. You can get the idea of the kind of answers that would give. Some of the answers might surprise you, but they'll make sense when the client articulates them to them, and that's what's important. And then it will make less sense as they examine it more, and they'll start to look at these rationalizations for holding this attitude in place, and it starts to unravel. That's what we're looking for. The next question, how does help is for weaklings make others wrong? You really just want to run out, exhaust out of them how they've been using this idea for that purpose, and then we're going to go deeper as we continue. And then the next question, what we're going to do now is throw the person into the circumstance or circumstances where they actually encountered something that was difficult to experience, that brought about this attitude or brought about the further use of the attitude. From where and when could you use help is for weaklings to make yourself right or make others wrong? You see, that from where and when gets them going to occasions, to incidents, to places and times. And it gets them processing more of those energies, of those experiences that they had been pushing away with this protective attitude. It can result very often in what we call a revivification, in which case they completely experience the environment in which this circumstance was experienced, encountered, and this phrase was generated, this attitude was used. So that's a great thing when that happens. And after a while, you'll see it's not hard to tell when that's happening. They're describing an uncomfortable situation and they're feeling it in their description. They're telling you what sensations were involved, what feelings. That's a great thing when that happens, and you certainly want to invite and encourage that. Again, by laying back, saying nothing, and allowing the person to go on and on and on as much as they need to. Right at this step, some really great processing is happening. So you let that fully roll. Again, the way you know when the client is done processing the last direction you've given them is not when they say they're done. You can pretty much ignore them telling you they're done, believe it or not. As long as they're looking away, that means they're still thinking about it. They're still processing it. And you don't need to say anything like, well, continue, or I don't think you're done. You would never say that. That's kind of evaluative. And you want them to depend on themselves to decide what's happening, not you. You're trying to empower them. But anyway, they may say they're done, or that may be in their intonations. But nevertheless, they are still processing. Believe it or not, you'll find this out if you watch this. They're still processing right up until the moment when they go back to you, looking you straight in the eye. That's when they're done. And then you give the next instruction, which in this case, the next question in this series will be, well, how does using help is for weaklings to make yourself right or make others wrong seem to you now? How does that seem to you now, you see? And that's a powerful question. It comes right out of something from a book called Creation of Human Ability. It's a particular technique in that book that is called description processing. It's assigned a number, R234. What's important about that is, actually in the book it says it's the most powerful process in Scientology. So we want to use this. It doesn't matter whether you're being a Scientologist or whether you're doing Scientology. It's just a great processing question. I call it the master processing question, and I build it into a lot of different techniques that I use. Just, how does it seem to you now? That gets the person really digesting the material. It also has the benefit of having the person tell you what stage they're at in processing the material, but that's not really the main purpose. It's not so you can find out how they feel about that material, if it seems to be meaningless or unimportant to them or useless to them. But on this step, the person will really directly process using that stubbornly held protective attitude in that particular way to make others wrong or make self right. Most of the time, you're going to find going through these steps, if you've done them as I just described, most of the time, that at this step, how does it seem to you now? They're going to say something like, it seemed like a good idea at the time, but it's really stupid or ridiculous or useless, or I don't need that anymore, to use it that way. Something like that. That's the end result of this particular section, this part of processing that stubbornly held protective attitude. Now, if they say something like it still has some use or something like that, only then would you go back to repeating and go through these steps again, starting with, how does help is for weaklings make you right, and going through all the steps all over again. In what's called standard Scientology, the stress is on repeating repetitive processes. But very often, if this is done this way, instead of indoctrinating in one question, one answer, hurry up, let's get to the next question, give me an answer, go through it again and again and again, you can see how that is more of a superficial way of processing. And if you really invite and encourage the client to just look at everything that comes up for them first time through and take all the time they need, that is going to be more efficient and deeper processing. So again, sometimes you will repeat these as needed and go through them again. But in my experience, more often than not, if you use these series of questions the way I give it here, more often than not, at the first time you ask how it seems to you now about using that attitude for this particular purpose, either immediately they're going to tell you, I don't need it for that anymore, it doesn't make any sense. Or they're going to process that attitude a little more as they need to in hearing the question and responding to it. And you just let them roll and they'll arrive at that conclusion all by themselves without needing to go through it again. Usually, not always. This same series of steps is then going to be repeated from another angle. The next angle being, how does Help is for Weaklings help you escape domination? How does Help is for Weaklings help you to dominate? The same series, you get the idea. From where and when could you use Help is for Weaklings to escape domination or to dominate and throw them into the actual experiencing of conditions and incidents that overwhelmed them at the time and have them processing it a little bit more? And how does using Help is for Weaklings to help you escape domination or to dominate others seem to you now? Okay? And the next idea that you're going to take up with this is going to be more direct. Here we're going to get to the core question. What is Help is for Weaklings intended to protect you from? And that's the whole point. It's a stubbornly held protective attitude. So here, whatever the client gives you is really getting to the core of what creates, what holds this attitude in place. You're going to notice, if you understand this and you're being perceptive, that what's happening as you go through this is that the underlying negative energy or charged emotion, or whatever you want to call it, that this attitude was created as a shield to protect the client from, is bleeding through. They're starting to process the negative charge, that's in the emotion of this attitude that really gets its energy and charge from the negative, overwhelming condition that they're trying to protect themselves from with this attitude. At some point, very commonly, at any point in here, and this happens frequently more than once, the client is going to express, now they're more into the overwhelming circumstances or incident that they were trying to protect themselves from. That's wonderful, because that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to crack that shell so you can now process what they really need to digest so they can be free of that energy and not feel a need to project a shield or wall of an attitude so as to kick away or dismiss the particular circumstances or area, which in this case is accepting help from others, and then be able to have that. It's very important. That's your goal here. So when the client starts to tell you about some experience, something that happened to them, in this case that really, really punished them for asking for help in some way, it would be, or unsuccessful in getting them help, or whatever it was, that's a beautiful thing. You let them roll with that. You let them process that. And sometimes that will be enough. But sometimes you're going to see that they haven't really come out the other end. It hasn't lifted. There's more direction that needs to be given so that the client will successfully process the particular incident or circumstance that is now opened up to them. It's very important to process this, to digest this for the client as soon as it opens up. When you wear down the wall of the stubbornly held protective attitude, you are basically kind of laying the client naked and exposed to overwhelming force and charge. So you don't want them to come up with a new stubbornly held protective attitude or take back the old one. You don't want them to suffer through the experiencing of whatever that charge is. You want to go right to it, have them directly process it. That's what you're going for. That's a beautiful thing when that happens. Don't get the idea that when they start talking about something that's hurting them, that's suffering, that they're complaining about, that this is something bad. No, this is what you're going for. Understand that. Counselors, processors, auditors, processors, whatever you want to call it, a lot of us need to understand better that when a client is thrown into a manifesting something really uncomfortable for them, that this is not something you've got to put a lid on. This is not something you've got to get away from. This is what you want. Now they have the opportunity to finally clean this up and fully digest it and process it to the point where it's no longer a problem for them. But that's only going to happen through their exposure to it and through their permeating and digesting this material. That's what you want. You want them to go, ah, or whatever it is. That's a good thing. And it doesn't take much to get that across to your clients, which makes for a better processing attitude for them and for you. My clients will tell you that we're pretty much always or frequently having fun in the session. We can laugh about it. I remember one time this was happening in a session, and the client remarked to me, "Oh, this is really some heavy stuff." And I said, "Well, you're processing it now." and we laughed for a moment, and we were both more into it. It was easier for him to just go right. He understood that this was exactly what he needed to do. That's all that happened. It wasn't a distractive comment, believe it or not. Don't be afraid to lighten up in the direction of encouraging the client to continue through the process. It's okay, no matter what you've been indoctrinated to think otherwise. Trust me. My clients will all tell you that. So, to continue, in this case, we've asked that key question. What is Help is for Weaklings intended to protect you from? Now we're getting to it. And they're going to give you something. They're going to say, well, it's to shame and embarrassment, let's say. The shame and embarrassment of saying, help me. All right, let's just throw that out there as something to make the answer understandable. It could be something like that, of course. Okay, so now the next question is, from where and when could you use Help is for Weaklings to protect you from shame and embarrassment? Boom. We're looking at a revivification here and now. Now it's opening up, and the client will experience some environment that they actually have still been stuck in to some degree all this time. At the end of this, or in some point, they're going to say something like that too. I always feel this way. This is always happening for me. And you knowingly just go, uh-huh, yeah, and yeah, that's a beautiful thing when that happens again. It means you're really getting to, this is going to make a difference. That's what we're going for. So then you let them roll with explaining that to you, the where and when. Now, sometimes, as I started to say, when you hit these areas, they're rolling with it. They don't get to completely, they won't get to the other end of it and fully process it and say, boom, that's gone, that's great, I feel good. It's not, they'll smile or something to indicate that painful, suffering condition for them. They feel they're good with it now. They're good with whatever the experience, that particular experience was. That does not always happen when you ask that question. Sometimes what you need to do is then use a particular technique or process to have them permeate and fully digest the material of that incident or circumstance, because the question alone only got them so far, didn't completely do that. And again, this can happen anywhere in this process, and it can happen any number of times. So when that happens, you want to use a technique to get them through that experience or the condition or energy of that experience. What I would use is a variant of what's called power processing. My own variant, which I call Power Process 6 Open Flow Dichotomy. It's very effective in completely processing the particular condition that has emerged for the client. So in the circumstance where they look up to you, they've processed it as much as they could with the from where and when could you use Help is for Weaklings to protect you from shame and embarrassment, and they haven't gotten all the way through it to the point where they're smiling and they obviously are cool with it and that's not a problem anymore. They're showing relief. That doesn't happen, and they're looking back up to you for the next question. That's one point where I would go to that particular technique. You may have other techniques you can use, but if we're following along my trail, you can use Power Process 6 Open Flow Dichotomy, which I'm not going to fully describe to you here. I don't want to digress that far. I'll do that in another video. Anyway, the point is, there are likely going to be times where you're going to shift gears and directly go after, with a processing technique, that circumstance, that condition that through these questions is fully emerging for the client. And now they're in the actual negative energy, the charge of the circumstance, and they've they've poked a hole through the wall of the stubbornly held protective attitude to allow this actual painful mental energy to be experienced. We're getting there now. So you use this technique as needed, and you fully process it, and until the person expresses complete relief over that. And we've made great strides at this point. Doesn't necessarily mean we're done with what we're doing. It usually doesn't mean that. We're going to go through all the steps. So when that's accomplished, the next question would then be, how does using Help is for Weaklings to protect you from shame and embarrassment seem to you now? Going back to the master processing question, how does it seem to you now? And the client should respond, not necessarily immediately, but very often, but anyway, give them the time and space they need to look at it, digest it, and most of the time, almost all of the time, at this point, the client's going to tell you something like, "Oh, it seemed like it served a purpose. It seemed like it was a good idea when I adopted that idea at that time, but it really doesn't help me. I shouldn't hold on to it. It's silly, it's ridiculous, it's useless." These are the typical type of responses you get there, which tell you that the client is now liberated from using Help is for Weaklings for that particular purpose, to protect from whatever that item given was. In this case, we're using shame and embarrassment. But we don't assume that's all there is to it. We then ask, has this attitude of Help is for Weaklings been used to protect you from anything else? And you might find more items to process the same way, or they might say no. You act accordingly. If they give you more items, you go through these same steps again. Okay, now having completed this step is done, and asking that question, has this attitude been used to protect you from anything else? Until going through this again and again as often as needed, usually it's just once or twice, until they say, no, there's nothing else it's been used for. Okay, now you ask this question. Is there a condition for which this attitude, in this case, all help is for weaklings, is there a condition for which this attitude has been your response? This is cleanup. You want to make really sure you clean up this area and see if there's anything deeper or anything more or other that has thrown the client into resorting to creating or using this particular shield of a particular attitude. Very often you're going to get more. Very often you're going to get, well, yeah. It's interesting how when you ask the right question, it's not hard for the client to find the answer. That in itself is a little fascinating to me. Anyway, so the client might say yes. Feeling small around other people, let's say. You know, accepting help from others makes them feel like the little guy. Whatever. Let's say that's it. So then we would then run Power Process 6 Open Flow Dichotomy, the process I mentioned, for completely resolving, you know, the negative mental energy, the emotional and other charge that impacts the person hard enough for them to feel they needed to erect that shield. And you process that accordingly until, again, it's completely relieved, and that condition for them no longer exists as such. Okay, so now we're going to look overall at this attitude or idea. with the master processing question in general terms. How does the idea of help is for weaklings seem to you now? And they're either going to tell you that it's silly, useless, unimportant, don't need it, I'm done with it. Most often at this point, that's going to be the answer. Or they're going to come up with, well, it still has its purposes. I still feel like I need it. Something like that is the other possibility. If that's what they come up with, then you then continue to process what else is there that the client has been using to protect themselves from. Only when you ask that question, they said they didn't have anything else. So that may now come up here when you phrase it that way. Or you can ask, either way, you can go to the question of, is there some condition? In fact, I would tend towards this. Is there some condition for which help is for weaklings is your go-to response? You've asked it before, but there's more there. So you can ask it again if they're telling you that this attitude still has a purpose for them, shouldn't be let go of yet. And you get another item if that's the case. Help is for weaklings makes me the boss over other people, or it helps me not to be bossed by other people, or help is for weaklings saves me from being screamed at, whatever it is. Again, we're talking about the person who was in a particular group, the C organization, where you were really heavily over punished if you failed to complete a task, a very difficult task by yourself, or said you needed somebody else to do something for you to make it happen. They consider that mostly unacceptable. Again, that's just the example I'm giving here because it was part of this actual circumstance, so it's kind of real. So anyway, if there is something else and they're still not ready to let go of the attitude, you then process that condition with Power Process 6 open flow dichotomy. That's what I would use anyway. There are other tools to process such charge and conditions, and you can use whatever you're comfortable with. I'm not saying it's the only way. There's never a one and only way to solve anything in this paradigm of emotional or spiritual counseling. So we don't want to be dismissive of the idea that we can still find better ways to do everything. Anyway, that's how that applies here. And we would use that and we'd process that condition. And then we would go back to, how does the idea help is for weaklings seem to you now? Now, in my experience, what I've just described has already gone through more turns than I've ever seen this procedure need to go through. But again, if you were to encounter more resistance to letting go of that attitude, you'd find out what the person felt they still needed protection from, and you would process that area. As I said, not likely. I've never seen it happen that much because this is a very effective procedure. One last step, and here's a relatively new idea to anybody with a Scientology background, but any negative gain processing, by which I mean any counseling techniques that are about resolving unwanted feelings, conditions, or attitudes, should immediately be followed up, should not be considered completed until you then run a positive process. Because ultimately, our goals are not merely an absence of negatives. We want the absence of the negatives so that we can then do or experience or create what we want to do or experience or create. That's really where we're all coming from. Basically, we're not just about not feeling pain or something like that. So the final step of this procedure goes like this. It's the positive step. Is there a positive ability or state of being related to this idea that would be good for you to create and maintain? And you get some really great answers here. This is really the good stuff, believe it or not. And no matter how happy and excited the client may be with what's just happened, you can go right into this positive step. Anyway, let's say in this case, the answer would be something like, to to work with other people cooperatively, to give help, to receive help, and to be able to succeed and help other people succeed and let other people help me succeed and to feel great about it. Let's give that as a possible answer. So then, whatever the answer might be, we then say, okay, so envision that for yourself as a three-dimensional reality. Experience it all around you, your full environment. Get the idea of how good it feels. That's really key. Get the idea of how good it feels. And then tell me about it. If the client doesn't simply tell you about it as they're doing this, tell me about it, you don't say immediately. You wait until they're done positively processing and getting this great idea. You'll see some very magical effects happen as we do this. And then when the person describes this to you, we take it to another level. Now, what we say is, okay, now, effortlessly create that existence or that ability or whatever they've given you. You say, create that in full dimension and sufficient degree and volume for it to completely permeate the full expanse of your space that you occupy and your beingness, and have it do so and fully experience it completely effortlessly. See, because we're dissolving forces and energies here. So we want to be very, very careful all along with our processing to not have the client put force into what they're doing. That just gives us more to process. It gets in the way. Abandon the use of force. So the client then proceeds, and you're going to see them express some really wonderful change in viewpoint, very positive and very capable. Sometimes, though, they may express some sort of negative feelings or something. Rarely. It's usually not going to happen here. Almost never. But if it does, you simply say, all right, how does that idea seem to you now? Go back to the master processing question. How does that seem to you now? And let them roll it until they're done answering and they look at you. And until they're at the point of saying, oh, that idea it really doesn't get in the way. It's really not a problem. It doesn't matter anymore. Okay, and get back to, okay, so now effortlessly create this, whatever that positive ability or state of being is, in full dimension and sufficient degree and volume for it to completely permeate the full expansiveness of your space, effortlessly, completely effortlessly is how we say it in English. Have it do so and fully experience it. And let them roll, and you're going to see something really beautiful happen. And this is going to be the point when they're done with this and let you know that they got it completely and express how it feels and all about it, that we're ready to say we're done with the process. And most of the time, it's the point at which to end the session so they can just continue to experience this unfolding and reverberating in their personal universe and allow it to fully flower for them. And that's it today for explaining stubbornly held protective attitudes. Thanks for listening.